Okay, who am I? Well, originally I was Robert Kershaw, and I grew up in Rhode Island, and I lived kind of an interesting life. I was very, very quiet, and one of my first experiences that I had put into the book, towards the end of the book, was when I met one of the neighbors who had just moved into the house, to the neighborhood. Their son came over to me and threw the ball to me, and I threw it back at him. He smiled and ran away. So this happened a few times, and then eventually I got to know who he was. And I was so excited that I met somebody who was Chinese. It was like, I met somebody from another country. What I told my mother was that I wanted to do something in my life that would stop people from treating kids like him the way he was treated. And I didn't realize I had said that. My mother told me that later on, that I had said that. But from that point on, I started some sort of a consciousness, and I don't know where it comes from. I think my father, in some ways, because he was very community oriented. My mother was a teacher, or a teacher's aide, and she was always working with kids and stuff. So she was kind of a caregiver in that sense too. And my father worked with the Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts. He got a lot of awards for doing stuff like that. And he actually was what they call a prognosticator, which means you predict the weather. And he had all kinds of ways he would predict the weather, and I have probably about 600 articles of newspapers of him, advisors, and their job was just to advise. And I was the director, and we had 60 kids with disabilities. So here we had this for the first time in 1969, which is when you didn't do things like this. We had a camp full of 90 people that I had no idea what to do with, but we did it. And it turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life. And we just had, this year we just had our 50th reunion for the camp. So it's been around for 50 years now. So from that, I started, I was in 4-H, and I had some sort of a curiosity for a lot of different things, and mostly for people. I was fascinated by talking to people and working with people. As a lot of people say, I usually don't shut up very much, but anyway. And while I was in 4-H, there was an opportunity to go to another country as what they called an international 4-H exchange program. And I had the opportunity to go to Brazil for a little bit over a year, and while I was there, I started, I think that was my first experience outside of the country, where I started to understand a little bit about culture, about different people, and most of my families, I would say, actually all of my families down there were Japanese. I know you're going to say, well, Japanese in Brazil? Well, yeah, Japanese in the United States too, But yeah, the families I lived with were Japanese, and part of that was because the Japanese population had a real big hold on the agricultural part of Brazil. And so all of my experiences with families there and groups and whatnot were all with the Japanese. They taught me Portuguese, which means I ended up with a Japanese accent when I spoke Portuguese, so I had to relearn Portuguese. But what I found when I was down there, I found there's a whole thing about culture shock and about culture, where when we don't understand people or we don't understand something, we're afraid of it. And they had these propane tanks in the kitchen that they used for their stoves. And I was sitting on the propane tank, and all of a sudden my host mother started laughing and giggling and just totally out of control. She was just laughing so much. And I asked my host brother, who was a comedian too, he liked to play jokes on me. I asked him what she was laughing about, and so he went over and asked her, and he came back and he said, "You look like you're filling up the gas tank." Because I was sitting on the gas tank, and that was hilarious to her. So from that point on, we were best friends, and it was just, one of those things. But what I found was that in a lot of caregiving situations, you're in the same thing. When you're a teacher, you're dealing with students. As you're the caregiver, you're dealing with students, and teachers are afraid of the students sometimes, and students are afraid of the teachers. And there has to be something there that kind of brings you together. And it's so important in situations like that, and in every. Almost a foot taller than he used to be, so he wasn't my little brother anymore, he was my bigger brother. And so all these different things, and I found going through that experience set me up for learning how to deal with all these different situations that I've been in all my life, and especially caregiving. That's one. But what I try to do with the caregiving, because I lived in New York, I've lived all over the place. I've worked on Broadway. I was a truck driver for a while. I've had all these experiences that I have in the past, and I look back at it, and the main thing that I found in looking back was that everything we do, we're leaving a legacy. I'm leaving a legacy with you right now. You're leaving a legacy with me if you're talking to me. When you go to the grocery store and you buy your groceries, if you're angry and you employee and you're working with customers, the legacy you leave about the store or the place you're working in is the legacy that's going to stay with that person. So if you leave a bad legacy for that person who's coming in to buy something, they're not going to come back. If you leave a legacy that's pleasant and whatnot, the store sounds nice, it's nice music, it's clean, it's whatever, they're going to come back. So legacy has to do with almost everything, and that's one of the main things that I've done for the rest of my life, working with kids with disabilities. I worked with the Department of a program for mental health. I'm a caregiver. I've done so many different things, and now I'm a writer. Go figure. And the whole thing about what I was doing in my life and what I had learned, and especially about death, I found death was the starting point for my book. I lost my father, my best friend, and my next door neighbor who was 90 within 3 months, and I had been their caregiver. So when the first one died, I didn't have time to grieve. So the second one died, I still didn't have time to grieve. And when the third one died, I was a mess. I was, I just didn't know what to do. I was depressed. I had no energy to do anything. I just didn't want to go anywhere. I hated life. It was just a mess. And after about 3 or 4 months of, beating myself up, a friend of mine was a psychiatrist, and I talked to him for a while, and one of the things he said was, why don't you write it down? Write down all your experiences. Write down how you feel, what happened, how did that come about? Just start writing. And he said, maybe by writing it down will be a way you can heal. So I started doing it. So this book basically, this one here is pretty much my healing experience for the most part. When I finally finished it, I just wanted to get it done so I could give it to my kids and my family so that they knew who I was. Because even my family didn't know who I was. They knew me as the guy that lived in New York or the guy that lives in Vermont, and he's my uncle or he's my brother or whatever, and that's basically who they knew. They didn't know that I was almost homeless once, or that I worked with so many famous people. I've I've been involved with, as a photographer, I've been involved with photographing people and working with Cynthia Lennon, Bette Midler I worked with for a little while, and I got to meet some of the most amazing people, and so this book basically became my healing point. And as I started writing, and it was all it was just a whole bunch of pads with a lot of words on it. And what happened was, as I started writing, I started to be curious as to where that experience and how I dealt with it came from. So I started thinking back. So the way the book is written, it starts out in the middle, it goes back to the beginning, and kind of culminates into the present. So it's kind of an odd book to read, but that's how I experienced it. And so writing it, it took me 25 years to write it. Thank God it's done. And the thing that I got most out of it was, like I went to, there's a bird museum here in Vermont where this one guy had the patience to carve every single type of bird that there was in Vermont, and he has a museum, or he's dead now, but he has this museum, and all I could think of was legacy. This was his legacy that he left. This will be there forever, or until the earth explodes or whatever. But this is the legacy that he left. He left that. I'm leaving the book as a legacy. I'm leaving this video as a legacy. It's all part of the deal for me. And as I was writing it, I did a program called If I Die Before I Wake, and that was a photo essay that I did in 1992. In 1992, there was a lot of people that I worked with HIV who were, HIV was a death sentence at that point. They knew they were going to die. They just didn't know how or when, and that was one of those things. Working with people with HIV and whatnot, I did a program called If I Die Before I Wake, and as a photographer I photographed people with HIV, and I gave them the opportunity to write a story or write a HIV positive, or just didn't know anybody with HIV positive. It always happened to somebody else or somebody else's family, and a lot of it had to do with a lot of people who were HIV positive didn't talk about it. So this was an eye-opener for a lot of people, having the opportunity to read in a very safe environment, see the person's face, and then read their story. And it was very emotional for a lot of people. So they gave me permission to use this, and in the book, I have one section in the book that has their stories. I didn't put their pictures in because I just wanted to keep their confidentiality. Most of them have passed, all of them have passed away since then. So I had to contact their relatives to see if they had any questions about it. And most of them said that they didn't want the name put in the book, so I had to come up with an idea, either use initials or their first name and nothing else or whatever. And then they came to me and said, that's not the problem. The problem is that if somebody knows who you are and they know that story, then they're going to know it was that person, and that they were related to us, and we don't want anybody to know that we had anybody in our family who was a drug addict or who was HIV positive or gay or any of that. So this was a big fear in the 90s, but I couldn't believe that it was such a big fear after the year 2000. It's like I thought we were over this, but I guess not. So I talked to my editor, and she and I talked for quite a while, and she said, well, why don't you change your name? So I took my middle name, which is Eli, and the last part of my last name, which was Shaw, and I thought it looked good, so that's who I am now.